Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Rose Horowitz. I am a Pulitzer-nominated journalist and the founder and host of Woman to Follow. I'm honored to introduce episode 25 of my Woman to Follow show with my incredible guest, Ann Nelson. We will meet her shortly. Shout out to my terrific producer, Stephen Kaplan. Please join us on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. You can post questions in LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. My guest today is Ann Nelson. She's the author of Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right. And it's, I'm going to introduce her in just a minute, but why do we need to pay attention today? Because we are 4 days away from the election. We have reports the law enforcement agencies are saying that they're fearful that there'll be violence during the election and post-elections about the results. And many of the GOP candidates, most of them have not accepted the results of the 2020 election. And as President Biden warned yesterday, between them not accepting results and the January 6th insurrection, he said, this is the path to chaos in America. It's unprecedented, it's unlawful, and it's un-American. So my guest, we will meet her. Ann is, hi, Ann.
Hi.
Thanks so much for joining me. It's a real honor to have you.
Good to be here.
Thank you. So I'll just say a few words about you. Ann is a research scholar at Columbia University. The Saltzman, you want to introduce yourself? That would be great.
Sure. I have divided my career and sometimes converged my career as a journalist and as an academic. And I am formerly the director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, so I've had human rights advocacy in my work as well. Most recently, I published a book called Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right. And I departed from my work in international relations because I was intensely concerned about where things were going in my own country. So I dropped my other projects to research this book. I'm still a research scholar at Columbia University's Saltzman Institute for War and Peace Studies. And when I published this book in 2019, it felt like political analysis, and the longer we go, the more it feels like war and peace studies. We see the country moving towards more energy, towards an authoritarian regime. We see violence breaking out in ways that would have been unthinkable in the past. And so my concern is only heightened.
Okay. Tell us something before we get to where we are today, but tell me how you came. I thought it was very interesting what I've heard about, what I saw in the book about how you came to this. You were listening to a radio station you described. And
that's right.
Tell us where you're from and how that, resonated with you.
Sure. I'm from Oklahoma, and I go back fairly frequently to visit friends and family there. And some years ago, I was driving along and turned on the radio at random and came across this fundamentalist radio station, and it was religious, but it was also overtly political. And it was repeating some outright falsehoods about John Kerry and the implications of marriage equality at the time, basically stating that if you had marriage equality, that would deprive heterosexual marriages of their sanctity. And of course, gay marriage doesn't affect heterosexual marriage at all. but they were sowing great concern and alarm among their listeners. And having run a nonprofit organization where we had to abide by the IRS rules that we would not engage in political campaigning, I was very surprised that this church outlet would be doing that kind of campaigning. So I started collecting research and came across the fact that this was not an isolated radio station in Oklahoma. It was part of a network of radio stations. And in fact, that there were 3 active networks that really blanket the middle of the country with right-wing programming that's coordinated. And I learned that all of them were run by members of something called the Council for National Policy. Okay. And at the time it sounded obscure, and what a boring name that is. I pursued it anyway and learned that they had gotten behind Trump at a critical moment and helped bring him to power. And then they emerged as one of the major organizations behind the events of January 6th. So what was obscure in 2017 became very overt with members like Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife, mm-hmm. and Steve Bannon has been a member, any number of officials from the Trump administration and right-wing radical Republican congressmen, as well as major donors. So it's begun to get more attention. And most recently, in the last January 6th committee hearing, they opened with an email from a man named Tom Fitton to Donald Trump before the last election, advising him to claim victory and stop the electoral count. This is before the election took place. Now, as it happens, Tom Fitton is currently the president of the Council for National Policy.
And so was this
their fingerprints mm-hmm. are everywhere.
Yeah. And was Tom Fitton he wasn't the only one talking about this to Trump?
But well, his email was used as Exhibit A by the committee, and mm-hmm. it was widely reported in the New York Times and the Washington Post and everywhere else, but they did not mention his presidency of the Council for National Policy, nor did they talk about the way that they had interacted with other members of the Council for National Policy, such as Charlie Kirk of mm-hmm. Turning Point USA, Cleta Mitchell, Trump's election advisor, who was on the call to Georgia with Brad Raffensperger, okay. and others, including major donors such as the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee, also run by a member of the Council for National Policy, which financed a lot of this activity.
And in the reporting, so your book has changed things. It's been seminal in the mainstream media, particularly, I guess in the New York, Washington, Los Angeles, in recognizing the power of this group. Before that, I guess my question too is, we've been hearing about the Christian right. You're calling it the radical right.
I am.
What is the distinction for us who like I've heard radical right, but now you're saying, and you're saying it's not Christian right. So what is the distinction?
It's not just Christian right. And I think that the Christian right suggests that a large proportion of Christians are behind this movement. And I don't find that that's the case. There are significant numbers of Christians who are actively opposed to it. And there are many other Christians who don't even, tune in to what's going on and would not particularly like it if they did. But the other point that I keep making is that I really feel that a major driver in this is money and fossil fuels. You go back to the beginning of the Council for National Policy, and you have Texas oilmen funding, and becoming members, and driving a lot of it. And you can also see that.
So this, just to give us some historical perspective, this began in?
Well, it grew out of fundamentalist pastors' objections to integrating their private schools, which also affected their revenues, because these television pastors like Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell had operations that made them millions and millions of dollars.
Mhm.
And so one of the ways they did that was creating segregated schools that were tax exempt as religious schools,
Mhm.
and using that as an alternative to integrated public schools in the past, after the civil rights legislation of the 1960s and its implementation after that. So that was a big impetus. But then you had the founding of the EPA in the 1970s, and that was concerning to the fossil fuels interests, and continued to be more so. And you also had major interests such as the Koch brothers, who objected to tax regimes that would support social programs and cut into their profits. So from a very early stage, you had cross-fertilization between the Christian right, represented by people like Falwell and Robertson, and more recently, Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council, and the Koch brothers' empire and their dark money, which Jane Mayer has written about so brilliantly. And when you look into the Koch brothers' backgrounds, religion does not make an appearance. In fact, I've tried pretty hard to find any religious affiliation or expression in their history. And I've looked pretty hard and I have not found it. What I would say is that their expression is for free market absolutism, rapacious capitalism, where you just hoard all the profits and let the poor die. So certainly religious right does not apply to the Koch interests. And one of the things I do in the book is show how the Kochs have their little, or major empire, where their donor activity and their dark money and their donor networks are very active, and they cross fund with the Christian right and the donor activity that is driven by people like the DeVos family, right? So one hand washes the other. So yes, Christian right is present. So is the libertarian, hyper-capitalist right, and they work together.
But when you're sitting in your car listening to the radio and to this show that you wouldn't expect to hear on the radio, all those people in Oklahoma who may not be radical right are listening to it as though it is a Christian station, and they're not aware of the influence of the Council
for National Policy. Yeah. And they don't see that these messages are coordinated. But when you look at Salem Media, which is the largest of these radio operations, it's very tailored to the region. So if you look at Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana, they tend to do religious broadcasting, but then they also own stations in the Rust Belt in, say, Michigan and Wisconsin, where they have something called Patriot Radio. And that's much more blue collar Reagan Democrat messaging without so much of the religious connotations. And that's messaging about immigrants are taking your jobs and sowing panic among people who have had a hard time making these economic transitions. So, it's political, and they tailor the message to the audience, which is, smart politics. And they really have a massive reach. One thing that I really criticize in both the circles of political analysis and in my fellow academics is that they really underestimate the power of radio. They don't understand that in swing states, there are a lot of people who drive cars, and they drive cars long distance, and they have the radio on. And my Eastern friends will say, "Oh, everyone listens to podcasts." Well, no, not everyone. And you also have this phenomenon where older, high propensity white voters are more likely to have the radio on in the car. So you also have this issue where radio is a very intimate medium. You feel like somebody is speaking to you, and you're with them much more so than television, where you may get up and get a snack from the refrigerator. So radio is a very important component of this, but so is the coordinated messaging that will go out through the Christian Broadcasting Network and on Salem's platforms, digital platforms like Red State and PJ Media. So it's really a kind of a sense around messaging system for these voters.
And where is the hole? It seems to me there's a hole, because the hole is that there's been, this tremendous decline of local papers, local media outlets. So have these, is that left the field more open for this radical right and the evangelical Christians?
Oh, absolutely. I taught for some years at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism in the late 1990s, and we were just watching the technological revolution eat into the profits of the local newspapers, which began to die off. And you have a huge number of newspapers, local papers, that have died off. And you also have a fraction of the number of professional journalists, especially working in these parts of the country, that you used to have. It's been especially critical in terms of state house reporting, where the legislation is made on a state level. So you don't have that journalistic oversight. And that vacuum has been filled in many cases by these right-wing radio and Christian broadcasters and Fox and Sinclair, and then these digital platforms and social media that are offering more propaganda than they are actual journalism.
Okay. And as somebody, I think one of the things you pointed out, I know you were a guest on the New York Times Read Along with Neil. And one of the things I remember you pointing out is that in journalism school, and I was a student that took classes at the J School and at SIPO, where you teach, I never heard anything about like paying attention to, the Christian right media. Like that wasn't, it's not a thing. And I think what you've done is really, brought attention to that. And that is groundbreaking. Because even now, when I read generally, I mean, I hadn't heard of this, this council, the CNP.
Yeah.
It's true. I mean, when I do travel and I've been to Oklahoma, but I like to look at the local papers, but there's no reason, like as a visitor, I would really listen to the radio.
Well, and I think that, in my world in New York City, people tend to think that radio or informational radio begins and ends with NPR. And yes, I point out in the book that NPR does exist across the nation, but in various states, it's severely underfunded and may not have powerful transmitters. They may be based in college towns, basically, operating.
They are even in Connecticut. Right? I think of the ones, they're in college towns, the NPR stations.
Yeah. And of course, since so many stations are listener supported in smaller populations that are poorer people who are less likely to listen to NPR, you can't depend on NPR to inform the entire radio audience. And in fact, in Oklahoma, I'll have the station on, and then I'll drive a few miles and I lose the signal, and then I have to drive a few more miles to pick up the next one. Whereas these other stations can be very powerful. And as I said, really blanket the area.
Okay. Well, thank you. I want to give a shout out to Paula Kiger, who is on the Digimentors team, producer and vice president. She's joining us from Tallahassee. And Monique Camara. I don't know if you know Monique. Okay, good. Yeah, she was a guest. I did a show, for my first show on women and war in Ukraine. And Monique was a guest. So she was very
Well, we're
excited
Twitter
to hear
friends,
you.
and we're all looking forward to the day when we can convene our Twitter friends in real life and
Yeah.
raise a glass.
Yes. um, and who else? Tim Sohn in Pennsylvania, who's a live streamer and journalist, is joining us and saying hello. Um, and you're here. So I'll meet you in Siena. It's a nice place to
Yes, let's
be.
all go to Siena. That sounds good.
Yes. Easy to get to from Florence. Yes. So what are the dangers we face? I'll go a little more background, but where are we now and how much influence has they had on have they had since you've written the book, which was it was published in 2019 and we're in 2022. So has it continued to grow? Is there anything you can say about its role as we face these elections and in 2024?
Yeah, well, I think that we're in a point of inflection, and that a lot of people regarded the 2020 election as a victory. What it really was a reprieve. It bought some time.
Mm.
And one thing that I've learned about this movement after studying it closely for some 5 years is that they always have a plan A, plan B, plan C, and so on. So and I wrote a piece for the Washington Spectator that is in the new chapter, the paperback of the book, about all of the ways that they tried to guarantee Trump's election in 2020, including weaponizing the COVID response in a way that was responsible for many, many thousands of deaths. They thought that really responding to COVID would be bad for the economy, which would be bad for Trump's reelection. And so they went into massive COVID denial and launched all kinds of fake cure operations that are still going on. And then when that failed, they wanted to disrupt the count of the Electoral College votes. And when January 6th failed, they set to work trying to make sure that Republicans would not lose future elections through manipulating our electoral process, which is much more vulnerable to manipulation than anyone would have thought. So how are they doing that? Well, we know about the gerrymandering. We know about the voter suppression. They have partner organizations such as the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, which drafts these bills and pushes them across state lines so they're adopted by multiple states at a time. That has been going
which do what? Which are aimed at
voter suppression, built on gerrymandering. They've taken a lot of steps to purge moderate Republicans from every level of the party, from people like Jeff Flake in Congress down to the precinct chairman. And there's been an operation that has been publicized by Steve Bannon and praised by Donald Trump to do that, to purge any Republican that would accept the electoral results and promise to work with Democrats would be purged and replaced by a MAGA Republican. And that's ProPublica has done a major piece of reporting on that, where thousands of precinct chairmen have been replaced. That gives them certain powers on a state level in terms of appointing electors. It's different in every state, but it's a position of influence. So then you have the independent state legislature doctrine, which they've also been pushing. And this idea is that you can go into a state, challenge the vote, say in 2024 for president, and if you claim that there are discrepancies in the vote, the state legislature can appoint its own board of electors, its own slate of electors, to vote their will rather than the state's actual popular vote. And it corresponds to an obscure section of the Constitution that is indeed there, but it hasn't been the practice in terms of electoral democracy practices. So they've been pushing for that doctrine to be embraced, and they have a majority of the state legislatures under their control. So depending on what happens next Tuesday, they have any number of mechanisms where they could lock in control of the government for the foreseeable future.
And that's what law enforcement agencies are saying could happen. I mean,
No, that's Plan
not
B.
law enforcement. That's a
Plan
different.
B is that you disrupt and you intimidate
Right.
the voters with people
Mhm.
standing, vigilantes at the polling places with guns,
Yeah.
intimidating prospective Democratic voters. So that's another part
Mhm.
of their package.
So what we had in 2020 with election, they're setting the stage for what's going to happen, you know, next week and in 2024.
They've been doing it for decades, really,
Yeah.
and refining their techniques, and really, I think there's been a lot of denial on the part of the government and the Democratic Party and the national media, and they'll say, "Oh, that sounds like a conspiracy theory." I keep hearing that. And I'm like, there's 1,000 footnotes in my book. I tell you everywhere that I find these things, and most of it is from their own media. These are their own statements. Here's the time code on their videos, right?
Mhm.
It's all there.
Yeah.
So you can call it a conspiracy. I call it a plan. It's a plan
Mhm.
that they execute with great precision.
Okay. We have a question from Monique Kamara, who's professor and in Siena and hosts a podcast called Kremlin File. So she has written in, I'm very worried about Mike Flynn's activities his Reawaken tour. What's his role on the radical right? Is he simply grifting because of his financial problems? How does he fit in the picture?
Well, Flynn has a multi-purpose role. He has appeared along with Ginny Thomas on the employee roster of the Council for National Policy. And this information was found by the researcher in Australia, Brent Allpress, and provided to the January 6th committee and others. So he's worked into their network. I think the Reawaken America tour has been filling in for the Trump rallies and serves a number of purposes. It keeps the base riled up. We also know that they've been collecting data, harvesting data from the participants through geofencing, and that was going on at rallies. And I would really expect it to be going on with the Reawaken America tour as well. And I write about in Shadow Network the way that they use this data and get people's cell phone numbers, and then through permissions, like when you have a cell phone and you download an app and it has 50 pages of explanation and permissions that you skip and you just say yes. What they're agreeing to in many cases is to allow them to harvest their contacts and to send text messaging to their contacts. So that way, if somebody has 200 people in their cell phone directory, you can have these messages going out supposedly from that individual, right? Saying, "Dear cousin Jim in Florida, I hope you're going to go on Tuesday and vote for the Republican candidate because it's really important to save the country. Love, cousin Fred," right? So they've been doing this for a few years. The Democrats' digital campaign tools really haven't even been in the same league as these.
Because in the 2008 elections, right, people complimented Obama for this digital, sort of revolution he spawned and how he raised money. So the Republicans have caught up or exceeded where the Democrats
I
are.
think that Obama was a charismatic candidate who appealed across party lines and had people who were up to date with technology, and they had a kind of social media based approach. So a lot of it was having Facebook ads and communications going viral. The response, and the other part of it was that John McCain just didn't even use email. He just was not of that generation and not very interested. So the Obama campaign had several big advantages. In 2008, it was deeply upsetting both to the Christian fundamentalists over issues around LGBTQ issues and abortion, but also the fossil fuels over Obama's environmental policies. And they banded together, and the Koch brothers funded a state-of-the-art political data platform that took this kind of data gathering and usage and networking it into cell phone apps for door-to-door canvassers that took it to a whole new place.
And so, when did this become this whole new place? Was this in 2016, or are we talking?
It was in use in 2016. Okay. They launched i360 in 2010. So they had time to develop it, and Cambridge Analytica was central to this, and all kinds of bad behavior has been involved. Not just, distributing false and dangerous information that can promote violent reactions, but Brent Allpress, my colleague in Australia, has also documented the use of a partner project called GLOO, GLOO, that harvests mental health data from people with mental health issues and brings them into the political fold by preying on them and pulling them into religious political circles. So it appears to be a violation of HIPAA, and it appears that nobody's enforcing the law.
And has it been publicized?
Well, Brent has spoken about it. I don't know that it hasn't been publicized enough, and it's still going on. And this is an operation that is also connected to the Council for National Policy.
It's super scary. It's just so frightening.
Yes, it is. And so, some people say, Michelle Obama says, when they go low, we go high. And I certainly don't think that the Democrats or anyone else should replicate this incredibly unethical and sometimes illegal behavior. However, that should not be an excuse for not using digital tools that are clearly legal and not unethical. I think that the Democrats have been, I know that they've been divided. So, for example, a lot of, over the last few years, data that's gathered on a state-by-state basis may not be shared across state lines. Data that is
meaning that it could be, but it's not. Is that what you're? I'm sorry. Are you saying that it could be shared, but it's not?
Oh yeah, it could be. But state level Democratic parties have to decide that they want to share.
Okay.
Also, when the Koch brothers founded their data collection platform, they decided that any Republican candidate that served their interests could have highly subsidized access to the data and use it for their campaigns. The Democrats have had a more commercial organization. Okay. So the same kind of data that a Republican can use for a pittance will cost a Democratic state level candidate, thousands of dollars.
Okay. So
and I'm told that
hurts.
But as of the last time that I looked closely at the digital campaign tools that were in use, say in the Georgia campaign for Warnock, it just, there was no comparison. The Republicans were still miles ahead of the Democrats.
So what would you say is a point plan for the Democrats in this way in using the data?
Oh, if I were a Democratic strategist or king of the Democrats,
queen,
king, Pope, I would go to the major donors and say, this is a really dangerous moment. And the way we've been working is not helping us, and it's not helping the country. You need to unify and modernize, all aspects of these operations, and also shake it up a bit, because an awful lot of the Democrats' money is spent on television ads, huge amount. And there are serious questions about how effective those are. Until recently, the Democrats had not been looking at things like Spanish language radio in heavily Hispanic states. Well, that's very powerful. Spanish language YouTube. I'm told that it's gradually changing. But what you really have had in the last few elections is the Democrats waking up and saying, oh, we seem to have eroded our Hispanic vote. What happened? And the answer is pretty clear, that the Republicans have been very savvy. And in fact, at a meeting of the Council for National Policy this year, one of their African-American pastors came in front of the meeting and was boasting about how they helped Glenn Youngkin win Virginia. And he said, we just bought out the radio ads in the African-American areas of Virginia, and it was really cheap, and we were the only ones in the market. We had no competition for that. And guess what? The African-American vote for the Republicans went up in Virginia. Okay. To me, that's counterintuitive, because, I think there are a lot of ways in which Republican policies for the African-American community are not helpful. But at a certain point, it's not about policies. It's about messaging.
Okay. Monique is saying, wow. And I think Carol King or CC King joined us. I think you know each other maybe from past reporting.
We have been neighbors, so we've known each other for a very long time.
Oh, that's great.
And she's been doing great work.
Yeah, she has. She's been an ally in trying to help me find great people like you. But I knew about you from Sri show, the COVID show, a while ago. And thank you, Strong Body, Strong Soul, Maria, for joining us and adding your comments. Question. Okay. Question. How to explain why a majority of journalists are not heard on national media, including NPR, alerting us to this systematic plan to hijack U.S. democracy?
I don't know. I will say that there are people in the national media that I do interviews with the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR. And in some cases, they honor their word in terms of citing me. And in many, many other cases, they simply use my research without any credit. So
what would they say without giving you credit? They would say the rise of the radical right and the CNP, but not say as shown in this book by Ann.
Yeah, Nelson? I mean, they'll interview me and I'll give them facts and sometimes even time codes on the CNP, show them where to look for information, and they'll use the information, and my work of 5 years disappears and it looks like theirs. So that's not always easy, but in other cases, like the Washington Post, I was fully credited in a major magazine story on the CNP. David Folkenflik at NPR is doing great work on media. So it's coming along, but very slowly. And I'm kind of puzzled about why the CNP part of it is missing from so many of these stories. And I don't necessarily have a good answer. I do think that the news coverage recently has been following the January 6th committee. And for whatever reason, the January 6th committee is stressing individuals rather than organizations. And I don't really, if you're a prosecutor, you don't really prosecute an organization of 400 people, even based on the behavior of the leadership. But I also wonder whether, there is a practice with a lot of media of trying to play both sides. And let's say that you get to a point where you have the movement represented by the Council for National Policy in full power of the American government in 2024. Do they want to be on record as being adversaries, or do they want to continue to function in a society that's under their dominion?
Big question. Comment from Maria, who's joining us from California. Glad to be here. Misinformation, ignorance of reality, loud does not mean right. Well, it depends what kind of right you're referring to. So thank you. Thank you, Maria. What about the big, when the elephant in the room right now, I think is social media and what Elon Musk is going to do. I mean, he's now said he's not going to put Trump on, right? On Twitter before the elections, but he has said he would. And, he's just, I don't know, every day is a new, thing that he says one thing to me. He says one thing like, I'm going to respect, I'm not going to make this a hellscape. And I'm going to have a council of moderation, but you just fired anybody from, your top person for that. What do you, is this further going to mean more voice for the right? I mean, they're seeing it as a victory, and the hate speech has unfolded, is increased. The Washington Post had this story about 500 times, and the Anti-Defamation League has documented it.
Oh, they're definitely, to the extent that there were still monsters in the closet, they're definitely letting them out. And racism and anti-Semitism have existed in our society and other Western societies for, as long as memory exists. But under certain governments, it is not considered polite to air them in public. And one thing that Trump did was to make it acceptable. He aired all kinds of inflammatory language in public and socially unacceptable language, and it was accepted. So now that means it kind of gives a free pass to other kinds of hate speech, and we're seeing a proliferation of it. It's really deplorable, and I think that I can't. My crystal ball is broken, so I don't know what's going to happen with Elon Musk and Twitter. I wonder whether his investment and his business strategy is sound. I wonder what would happen if, people with, you're already starting to see people with huge followings leave Twitter. Mm-hmm. What would happen if everybody else started blocking ads systematically? Mm-hmm. There was a viral movement to block ads, right? Mm-hmm. That would further undermine his position. And there are a lot of people who say, Twitter is a kind of delivery system that should be seen as a public good and treated like the post office, right? To have one person control it.
Well, he has said that he wants this as a public square, but by the things he's done and retweeted, he's spread disinformation rather than making it a free, what I consider a free public space, a free and open.
Well, if he wants to deed it over to the American people, I think that would be just fine. And I think you could set up a a very wise committee that would say, what do we need from this public utility? We have other public utilities. We have public libraries that function pretty well when they're adequately funded. So
Right.
that's not impossible. I think he's going to be saying all kinds of things to placate his critics, but we have to see what he actually does.
Okay, thank you. A question from Maria, I know, who has a few children in school. Seeing a boost in interest in local school board elections. Thoughts on moving into education? I guess she's saying, has this radical right? I think you would say they have, but have they moved into? Is that one of the things that they are targeting and doing it successfully for their influence?
Absolutely. And I wrote a piece for the Washington Spectator on the school board takeovers and disruptions. Look, and their success in the Glenn Youngkin campaign in Virginia. And in fact, if you look at Thomas Jefferson High, which I did in this piece, it's a very selective public high school. And you had really kind of ground zero for school board disruption going on there. That's where they kind of created the approach, and it's been spreading all over the country. It's really ugly. You have school boards where people have been used to talking about how do you teach math, turning into shouting matches and insults and vandalism and threats, and just incredible levels of incivility. This is not spontaneously generated. I found that there were online training sessions for what they call school board activism, which means disruption and takeovers, for several Council for National Policy core organizations. The Family Research Council has national training in this. The Leadership Institute has national training for this. So they give people the tools to disrupt their public schools. And this is part of a larger campaign to undermine public education, to undermine teachers' unions, and to sow chaos in communities that have been going along perfectly well for a very long time. And I've seen it in Oklahoma in cases where you'll have a fundamentalist parent coming and disrupting the school board, and it turns out that this person doesn't even have kids in public school. They're homeschooled. So they're just functioning as an agent of chaos and a disruptor. And again,
that's really scary, because I would say, my youngest kids graduated maybe 4 years ago from high school. And then I don't think even in a blue state like Connecticut, you saw this, but now during the 2020 elections, I was, at a rally with the Democrat, and there were people there who were, wanting to ban books and getting involved in, in local school boards you never heard of this kind of thing.
And I will say that, it's not spontaneously generated, but there are issues that can feed the contention. And I think that the Democrats have not allowed enough discussion of some of this. So, even liberal Democrats might pause over the question of, a trans student competing in girls' sports, right? People don't talk about it openly, but there are questions that arise. I think people have not gotten used to the pronoun wars. And the other part of it is that, parents can be very liberal until it's their kid. And I think part of what's going on is, including with this affirmative action case before the Supreme Court, is that, if you feel that your kid will be at a disadvantage in applying to an elite institution, all of a sudden the noble politics can take a back seat.
Mm.
So there's a lot to work out there, but I do feel that all of these questions can be worked out with civility and discussion and support in a community. And these people are simply working in bad faith. I don't think that they're planning to work them out. I think they're planning to undermine public education. Why? Well, public education is where kids go to school with people from different backgrounds, from different religions, different economic classes. They become friends. And a lot of times, public education in America has been a real motor for democracy. And if you have homeschool kids, they don't have to mix with anybody. If you have kids in religious schools, they only mix with the people of their own faith. So if you want to undermine democracy, undermine public institutions.
Which is what we were seeing from DeVos, right? The way she wanted to move, support funding for religious schools, private
Absolutely.
schools.
And she spent massive amounts of her own money going after teachers' unions and so on. And her parents and parents-in-law have been core members of the Council for National Policy and major donors. So I call her the crown princess.
Okay. I guess some people are commenting that this is, could be catastrophic, but Maria is saying, I think national people need to stand their ground and keep emulating positive collaborative mindsets. So
I agree, but I also think they need to look at the electoral map and see how power is allocated in our country. Because simply reinforcing the sense of virtue in your own community doesn't affect these elections that will determine the outcome in Congress, which will determine national law. So I think that everybody needs to double down on their civics lesson and figure out how this country works and where they can engage to be effective.
Well, and we need more voices like you, and you getting quoted in major publications and in forums like this to be heard, so that people hear this. Because maybe like you say, that sometimes people say to you, that's a conspiracy theory. And from my perspective in news, that maybe, that a major news publication is hesitant to use this word, to use the name of the organization, because that's harder for people to understand. You have to, give another layer of, here's what it is, here's how it started. And it's easier to blame it on a social issue that people are against, like ban books, but it's not but that's just it seems to me a segue into getting control of school boards.
Well, and a lot of people, this is a complex story, and a lot of people do not read long form work, and I think that's part of the problem. And I've talked to any number of journalists, and they ask me questions. I say, well, it's in my book. Have you read my book? Oh, I don't read books. I just flip through. And it's like, well, it's a book for a purpose. Shadow Network, I say it's lifting the hood and shining a flashlight on the machinery. If you want to respond to it, you should understand it. And I went to a lot of work to do that.
I have read some of this, so I will.
I
got to a local library that was big enough that I thought they would have this book yesterday, because we planned this on short notice. So, and I just thought, well, let me take a question from Carol King. How are we to understand what is happening to our Supreme Court, and do you see connections between your research and the way our higher courts are evolving? I know that there's an answer. You say yes, but
as it happens, it's in the book. When the fundamentalists and other interests of the Council for National Policy were deciding whether to back Trump or not, they cut a deal with him and said, we will give you money and canvassers and strategists if you give us what we want, and that is an anti-abortion federal court. And Trump said, fine. And when he nominated Neil Gorsuch, he invited the interests in question to the White House to celebrate. And the list of acceptable judges came from 3 groups run by members of the Council for National Policy: the Federalist Society, Heritage Foundation, and the National Rifle Association. Now, everybody should be asking themselves, what the hell are we doing having the National Rifle Association contribute to the list of federal judges? But that's what happened.
Okay. Let's see. There might be another question. Let me just see. Oh, from Monique. How important is it to see Trump and the other members of the coup brought to justice for the 2024 elections? Or are we past a point where doing so would make a difference?
Well, we're looking at a point where a lot of the guardrails of our democracy are gone. All of us in, like high school civics learned that we had a system of checks and balances because we had 3 branches of government: the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative. We are looking at the strong possibility that all 3 will be controlled by one party, which is anti-democratic as of 2024. One of the remaining guardrails that is still semi-functioning is our legal system. And if people lose hope and lose faith in our legal system, I think it might be game over. So in as much as Trump and his associates have committed crimes, it's extremely important that they're held accountable. But it's also extremely important that people don't think that will solve all the problems, because this organization has always got plan B, plan C, etc. And right now, they're saying that they support Trump, but they've also got Mike Pence, who is Trump light. They've also got Ted Cruz. They've also got Ron DeSantis in reserve. Mm-hmm. And any one of those people will give them the policies that they want. That is absolutely clear. Mm-hmm. So Trump might be more of a liability. He has his charisma. He has his base. But if they were going to invoke the independent state legislature doctrine that I mentioned earlier, people might think, oh, Mike Pence is so anodyne and bland, he's the safe one. And if you look at his record on women and LGBT people and environment and everything else, he's not safe. He's just bland.
Well, I mean, during the people were saying that Pence would be worse, than Trump as president, because he has these long, like Trump just, he was a Democrat, right? I mean, if you're a New Yorker, he was a Democrat. So, but yeah.
Well, and both Pence and Cruz have a major charisma deficit. Mm-hmm. So there is that.
Yeah.
But the next contest will not be determined by the usual rules.
Tough. Comment from Carol: please ask your local public library to order Anne's book if they do not already have it. They will do this. It's easy and important thing we can all do. It's a good point. I had some other questions about your background, but it's getting late. So one thing I always, this Women to Follow started as a hashtag that was asking people to name 3 women to follow. So tell us, Anne, your woman to follow.
Yes. Well, the first one is Tamsin Shaw, and she is a professor at New York University, and she is extremely interesting and expert on the question of Russian influence in US and British politics. And she's also a fine writer. So she is the first. The second is Cynthia Miller Idris, And she is a scholar who is expert on disinformation, but also has been looking into ways to address disinformation. And I've seen her recently on the NewsHour. I was at a conference at Yale with her a couple of weeks ago and was very impressed by her approach to the research and how she's really trying to find constructive avenues to address these crises. And the third is Nandini Jami. And she is somebody who is taking on advertisers who promote extremist and anti-democratic projects. So, for example, advertisers that will use Steve Bannon material or allow disinformation channels. And by publicizing, a lot of times these advertisers aren't even aware of what is showing up on their digital feeds. It's all handled by agencies and algorithms. And once she names and shames them for this anti-democratic commercial activity, they can reverse their policy. And so it's very constructive, it's very innovative, and it's fun to participate, and it's important as well.
Well, thank you. Those are really great choices, and I will put them out and spread the word about them. I guess in closing, I would ask you, what are your final thoughts and in terms of what we can each do as citizens at this point in time?
Well, I think that we should double down on the electoral process and have one-to-one conversations with people, especially people who don't live on the coast, don't live in big urban areas. Listen to them, talk to them, try to share thoughts about the importance of democracy and why election deniers are dangerous to democracy. I haven't given up hope in the democratic process yet. And I have lived through political violence and dictatorships as a reporter, and it's really worthwhile trying to avoid those. Please believe me. And I also think doubling down on commitment to community. So run for the school board, run for precinct chairman for your party, participate, get involved, roll up your shirt sleeves, talk to the young people, talk to young women, and help them understand that being cynical is not an escape. That yes, it's a flawed system, a deeply flawed system. It needs renovation, but it is so much better than the alternative that's on offer.
Really great advice. Thank you so much, Anne. Really a pleasure to have you and an honor. So thank you.
Thank you, Rose.
Yeah.
And thanks to your audience.
Thank you. So I will just end with asking people to join me for my next Women to Follow show, which will be post elections, and to please follow Women to Follow. I always have it. My pin tweet is always either about an upcoming show or highlighting something from a current show like we've just seen. So please do that and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And Monique is saying thank you. Thank you so much, Monique, for being here. Really great to have someone from abroad doing it at 12. Allowed that to happen for Europe. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to my producer. And I will see you for the next one soon. Thank you.